Hello, I'm Guy Clapperton, contributing editor of Computer Business Review. And with me today is Leigh from IBM's Security Services. Leigh, welcome. Let's start at the beginning. Every computer, even the smallest unit that you buy from a computer superstore, comes with security built in. They use it as a selling point. So why do we actually need more? What's missing?
Excellent question. In terms of what's missing, it depends on obviously what's built into the device and what the device is for. What we're seeing is an increasing proliferation in the complexity and the type of exploits that we're seeing in the intrusions. Security tends to scale badly with complexity from a systems design and integration point of view. So as systems increase in complexity, sometimes you find that the security actually worsens. Not always the case, but sometimes the case. So one of the things that we find increasingly is the need to keep pace with the changing threat landscape that we're seeing, and this is to do with the sophistication of attackers, the complexity of technology, and the types of intrusions that we're seeing. So in terms of what's missing, it's really about understanding where the threats are coming from versus where the technology is going.
Okay, so we've established the complexity of the threats is increasing, but where are these threats coming from?
Well, again, that could be almost anywhere. So a few years ago, there was a sort of prevailing view, if you like, that threats were coming from nation states or external sources, large-scale threat actors, whereas increasingly we're seeing threats from domestic locations or from hacktivism, where people are motivated by political or religious ideology and so on and so forth, some personal view which allows them to qualify the actions that they're taking from a threat point of view. So it's diversifying, I think, is the key message there, but it's about also keeping pace with that and understanding that those threats not just diversifying from the actor side of things, but also from the complexity and the technology. So that we're seeing threats levied against different types of technology. So embedded systems, devices in cars, devices embedded in buildings. Those are now presenting threat vectors, if you like, which we haven't previously seen.
Okay, people hear an awful lot about threats. There's a lot of stories in the papers about cybersecurity all the time. How do you avoid getting sort of punch drunk from all this warning, 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 big stickers all over your computer and everything like that?
Absolutely, yes. It is a risk. And certainly particularly in the public press and in the public view, information security is becoming less of something people do in dark rooms and more, this is relevant to me as an individual or as a citizen. Ensuring that you take information from credible sources is difficult, particularly when the quality of reporting can change in terms of the information availability and the availability bias around those sorts of issues. So credible sources, one thing that's great about the information security community is that we tend to be quite good at sharing. There are lots of sites out there which share information, and they do that in near real time. There's lots of good RSS feeds. Things like, well, from an IBM point of view, we produce the X-Force quarterly reporting, which for us is a mechanism by which we determine where we're seeing new threats coming from, the changing nature of established threats, and we publish that every quarter. So there are lots of credible sources, not just from IBM, but out in the wider industry, which people can use to identify particular threats that are relevant to them. And I think that's quite a key piece, that rather than saying, oh, we're worried about information security, we're worried about this bits of information security because they're relevant to us in our context.
Tell me something about the threat on the scale of a whole enterprise. What damage can actually be done?
Immeasurably, immeasurable damage in some cases. It depends on the context of the organisation, the systems they're using, the threats they face. A lot of organisations increasingly are including information security risks within their corporate risk strategies and their approach towards risk management. Techniques such as those described by ISO 27000 or IS1, as relevant in the UK, allow organisations to run risk assessments, define the threat based on the threat actors, define the impact of those threats and understand where their assets could be compromised. So again, it comes down to the threats that you face from those actors, the organisation's systems, how they use technology, and the services they're providing. So although it's not a perfect function, you take those things in aggregation, which tell you a lot about your threat surface and how that can impact on your information systems, by which you then may discover what the impact of that would be should those systems be compromised.
Okay, I'd like to pick up one point you made there. You mentioned the ISO standards as applicable to the UK. On an enterprise level, how useful is it to have a single country standard to adhere to that?
I think that's a really good point, and we are seeing an increasing movement towards globalisation, and that's in information security as well as more generally, particularly in the private sector. And the use of standards across multiple jurisdictions is getting harder. However, of those, if you like, multi-faith security systems, they all present common themes and theories. So sometimes it's a case of saying, well, we're applying this standard for regulatory or jurisdictional reasons in terms of geographic jurisdictions. but many of the principles are the same, so they are not incoherent between those standards. And governments have to protect their own assets, which is why they define their own standards based on the threats they feel and the development of their nation and their reliance of that nation on particular technologies or technology in general. From a commercial standpoint, organisations which are globally administered obviously have a regulatory aspect for those jurisdictions in which they operate. So things like ISO are a good mechanism for saying, well, we know these will be potentially relevant in all of our jurisdictions, whereas there would be certain nuances based on those countries which they may have to implement particular requirements for.
So I think we've established the threat fairly well. What practical steps can people take?
That's a very broad question, and the one thing I would advise people to do is think about their context. There's certainly no shortage of guidance. And previously we talked about some of the different standards, both regulatory and statutory, and also just industry good practice. There's no shortage of guidance out there to be referenced, to be considered and to be digested, but the core component of that is understanding it in the context of the organisation. So that really comes back to the risk assessment piece, and many organisations are adopting a risk-driven architecture such that they're identifying the risks they face based on what they do, how they do it, the technologies they employ within that process. They then look at those risks and look at the guidance from industry. That can be from academic sources, it can be from just general industry guidance, or from the sorts of areas we've discussed in the nation state and so on and so forth. So when it comes down to understanding what it means to them, that's really the key piece. Identifying the risks, understanding how best to treat those within their context. And ultimately, people have a finite amount of resources to spend, and that's financial resources ultimately, on security. So it's understanding where the benefits are based on the risks they're able to treat and the complexity of implementing some of those technologies. But simple things, potentially simple things, like role-based access control, just understanding from a business point of view how your users are interacting with the system to ensure that you're implementing things like least privilege, to ensure that people aren't getting elevated privilege when they don't need it, and also implementing audit and protective monitoring such that they can then understand parts of the system and how they're interacting, where those changes might be appearing, which might suggest a change in threats. But increasingly we're seeing a move towards security intelligence or situational awareness, whereby we are leveraging information the system's producing to improve its security stance or posture.
Obviously there's a lot of information out there, particularly on the internet, some of it good, some of it bad, some of it from sources as good as IBM, some of it from people claiming to be Elvis Presley. How do you qualify the information, the quality of information that you're actually going to get? What do you look out for in terms of time wasters? What do you look out for in terms of the really real deal?
Obviously I'll be sceptical of Elvis Presley, not more generally, but in the context of information security, not known for his love of that area.
You're not known for your hit records either, but carry on.
Absolutely true, yes. I think effectiveness is a key measure, and effectiveness is a little bit sort of vacuous really, but it's about understanding what is effective in your industry. Looking at what your competitors are doing is always a good way of looking at that. If you're in financial services or if you're in oil and gas, look at what other people are doing, look at what's been proven in practice, and I think that's a key measure. And also extending existing capabilities, thinking about where you have the kernel of something which you think could actually be more effective. So don't be afraid to not just embrace new technologies, but think how you could more creatively and more usefully apply the technologies you've already got. It's not always about capability development. Sometimes it's about changing business process and understanding how you can use technologies more effectively that you already have in place. In terms of understanding the guidance more specifically, again, it's really about seeking advice in some cases. That's within your own organisation and sometimes subject matter experts, where they can actually distill some of that complexity. Some of the technical controls, I mean, I mentioned back in a previous answer. Most people take the view that, oh, that's just a directory server or it's Active Directory or LDAP, when in fact it's more about, to get it right, it's more about business process. So it's understanding what are your business analysts doing and seeing how those controls can be made effective within your particular environment.
I was going to ask about processes people need to put in place to keep their systems safe, both in terms of technical and of course managerial, because there's still a heck of a lot of user error out there. Absolutely.
Certainly the human element of security is an ongoing, not problem, but it's an ongoing area that we have to contend with. And even where we have sort of pseudo-human interfaces, such as machine-to-machine interfaces, which are modelling human-type behaviours, that again presents a similar sort of process. But I tend to think of controls as a security architect as technical, operational, procedural. And some of those controls might be, network intrusion detection, which are very much in the technical space, or you might have performing risk assessments, which are very much in the operational space, the implementation, the wherewithal aspects. But then finally, procedural might relate to things like security operating procedures or end-user licensing, such that you manage actively what somebody is allowed to and what they are not allowed to do with the system. So in terms of understanding within your organisation what the technical or the operational or procedural relate to, that's a very key and important piece for security managers to consider.
Okay, do technologies like cloud or virtualization help here or hinder you, where you can sort of switch a user off or on and it just vanishes from their computer?
Yes and no. With all new technologies comes good and bad, I suppose, particularly from a security standpoint. Increasingly people are moving into shared service and distributed models of computing, and cloud is a good example of that. But one of the issues there is that you're perhaps artificially extending the boundaries of your system, such that previously the people who managed and operated your systems worked for you, whereas now you're going out to an external provider. So from a risk assessment point of view, it's about understanding what those actors represent to you as a supply chain, to the effectiveness and the availability of your business. So in terms of treating cloud and virtualization, yes, there are new risks that addresses, but it also helps in some instances. For example, network separation and segmentation tends to be easier to implement because it can be provided via infrastructure as a service type mechanisms rather than having to bake it in themselves.
So if people wanted specifically to find out what IBM had to offer in terms of good quality information with no sales pitch on this sort of area, where would they go?
X-Force, our X-Force blog, which isn't Men in Spandex, you'll be pleased to hear. It's actually our vulnerability research team, between 500 and 600 people now in the States predominantly, but we have links to them in the UK. They provide open source information, so treat them as an intelligence feed if you wish. But obviously we have a portal on ibm.com/security which shows our product portfolio and the services and professional services we provide.
Leigh Chase, thank you very much indeed. Do come back to this microsite very soon where we'll have further updates. Particularly soon we'll have something on the EU and updates to that legislation that's coming on security and also on security in the cloud. My name's been Clapperton. Thank you for listening.